Good evening and welcome to this evening's guest lecture. It is my pleasure at this time to introduce Dr. Paul Mitchell, Chair of the Department of Urban Planning in our college here, to introduce tonight's speaker. Paul.
What does a two-hand clap mean? Better than a one-hand clap, I guess. Good evening. Damian Kelly is the current new Dean of the College of Architecture and Planning, where he's been since July of this year. Dean Kelly received his Bachelor of Arts degree with honors in political science from Williams College, his Juris Doctor and Master of City Planning from the University of Pennsylvania, and a PhD in public policy from the Union Institute. Eric has worked in several legal planning and multidisciplinary consultant situations in the Philadelphia area after he finished his formal schooling. But he returned to his native Colorado in the mid-70s, where he founded a law and consulting practice firm, which he served as president and project manager for 15 years. As a consultant, he has worked with a variety of clients and projects in more than 20 states. While a practitioner, he served for 15 years as adjunct professor in the College of Architecture and Planning in the University of Colorado, Denver. In 1990, he left Colorado to become professor and chair of the Department of Community and Regional Planning at Iowa State University. As a scholar-teacher, he has a list of over 30 publications. On the practitioner professional side, he has done 4 planning advisory service publications, and those planners among you would understand that those are publications written expressly for the purpose of practitioners. He has been active in professional organizations. He was president of the Iowa chapter of the American Planning Association. He has been an active member and officer in 5 national committees of the American Planning Association. And he is currently one of the 2 nominees for candidate to the office of president-elect of the American Planning Association. One reason that Eric was selected to be dean of this College of Architecture and Planning was that his career represents such a strong combination of professional practice, community and professional service, and academic experience. As an added strength, he has worked with firms and representatives from all of the design professions. He is particularly qualified and in a strategic position to present a discussion of his topic, Design Education, the Built Environment in the 20th Century. Please welcome Damian Kelly.
Thank you. You all are nice to be here tonight. We'll turn on the microphone in case you can. Looks like okay. I appreciate you being here. I hope you all filled out your guests, which we do give before the lectures in my field. It's important to me. I've got we got an undergraduate student, Greg Smith, and Megan Kelly, who is in relation to this grad student in the Department of Urban Planning, who are helping to compile the data tonight, and I will be using that data in my lecture. I like to do a more interactive format with this size audience. We can't quite do that, but we would like to have some of the information you're sharing with us. As I talk about design education tonight, I'm going to be focusing partly on what we do within this building on a regular basis, which is educating traditional students in the traditional classroom. But there is a much larger need that you will find represented throughout my talk, which is that of the need to represent practicing professionals in society at large. And those 2 larger educational target audiences are essential elements of addressing some of the issues that I'll talk about tonight. Before I get into the substance of the talk, those of you who have heard me before will recognize some common themes, and you may wonder about that. I am absolutely convinced that part of the role of a leader is to espouse certain themes over and over. And I will stay on these themes for some period of time. At some point, if no one is interested, if no one else picks them up, we'll move on to some new themes. But you will hear some things tonight you've heard before. A whole message about life, some things about the interdisciplinary You're going to keep hearing those for a while, and my hope is, and I think I'm seeing people pick up on some of them, they'll keep hearing those things in different contexts. But I promise you I haven't heard me talk before. There are three basic themes to my talk tonight. My features were talking about the 21st century. Maybe I could work with 3 and 7, but I basically have 3 themes and 3 major topics under each one. And I'm already running behind. First, our need as design educators to lead society to address certain substantive issues that affect practice, that affect society at large. Our need to be interdisciplinary, which I think is a pressing need and affects our role on this campus. And our need to design the process. Notice this doesn't say design as a process, but it says to design our own educational process to serve a variety of needs that we'll talk about this evening. First, the need to lead society, and in particular to lead our professions in serving society and in leading society to address major issues. One of the questions that we have to face is whether we're a lamp guiding the way to the 21st century or a mirror simply reflecting the past to our society. Obviously, the answer is that we should be some of both, and with distinguished historians like Paul Mitchell and Warren Vanderbilt in the room, I would be remiss to ignore the past. But we can become so wrapped up in the past and tradition that we lose track of where we're supposed to be leading society. Some of you will notice that despite the world map that forms the backdrop here, most of the substantive issues that I will address are focused rather narrowly on the United States, which I regret to say is where most of my experience is focused. I think some of them have global implications, and I don't mean to ignore the importance of our global work. It is indeed important, but the 3 major issues that I'm going to talk about tonight are focused in the United States, which is where most of my practice is taking place. The first of those is housing. The second is urban form. The third is the sustainable built environment. And about the time I finish talking about those, we're going to have some results back that the students have been compiling, and we'll see what kinds of issues you all have listed. Not that I will talk about them in depth, but just to show you the breadth of concerns in this room. Housing, to me, remains one of the most pressing concerns that ought to be concerning our profession. It ought to be the focus of our efforts, and yet it's not. We continue to deliver the 19th century house to serve the 20th century family as it approaches the 21st century. That 19th century house is relatively expensive, it's inefficient, it's been called sexist, to not come back to that, but it's neo-traditional, right? Wonderful. I don't know if you've seen progressive architecture yet. Mine came today and I was looking at it. It's like grabbing light and heat, and it's showing the neo-traditional details on some of the 19th century houses that we're dealing with today. But to understand the dimensions of this issue, I've often thought about taking a time machine and going back to roughly the middle of the 19th century and picking up a guy named Marconi, maybe a little past the middle of the 19th century. You may remember Marconi. He had very little to do with housing. What he was dealing with was something called radio and telegraph. And he was involved in the early experiments to do distance transmission of telegraphic signals, which had been largely transmitted by wire, and all of a sudden they could transmit them over a distance without wire. And they were successful in doing that, and we view Marconi really as being the father of radio transmissions for that reason. Let's say we go back and get Marconi and bring him forward and take him to Radio Shack tomorrow and show him some of the wonders of Radio Shack. And of course, he would be particularly surprised if perhaps we had stopped off in the 1930s and maybe stopped in a Sears store, because in fact, when we did have Radio Shack, and looked at some of the console model radios about the size of this podium. I imagine most of you have seen them, even if you didn't have the privilege, as I did, of playing one of my grandparents' house at one point. For roughly a week's wages of the average worker in the 30s, you could get a radio about the size of this console that might get 3 or 4 stations very bad. But if we take Marconi to Radio Shack, for an hour's wages of the average worker, he'd buy a little walkie-talkie about this size. For 2 hours' wages, he can buy 2 little walkie-talkies, and 2 people can talk to each other over quite great distance, a city block or a couple of blocks, for very inexpensive pieces of equipment. Or you can buy a little Walkman about the size of this microphone that I have in my pocket for a couple of hours' wages that will receive 20 to 30 stations, play tapes, and do it all very nicely with a great deal of quality. And if Marconi looked at these devices, which are remarkably small, remarkably inexpensive, just remarkable technological achievements, I think that he would understand how the radio transmissions work. Because, of course, those are the same principles that he worked with. He would not have a clue how these were put together or what all these microchips inside them are. Now, why do I tell you that story? Because just suppose that while we were picking up Marconi, we picked up the guy who built Marconi's house. And we take him out to the newest subdivision in Muncie, or maybe we go to the big city of Indianapolis, and we take this guy for a tour of the house. I will tell you, he could build that house. The trash compactor might be a little bit confusing. The shine of vinyl that has replaced the linoleum with which he would have been more familiar might look a little bit different, but it's the same house. Now, why is it that a society that has had these enormous advances in electronics, that in something as basic as home appliances, although they haven't shrunk, they have become much less expensive in regard to wages, and they do many, many more things, that has changed transportation literally from the horse and buggy to sending shuttles off into outer space, to sending rocket ships to the moon, literally. Why are we still building the same house that we were building 150 years ago? Dolores Hayden has attacked this model as sexist, and I got into a bitter argument over this with a female faculty member, and I said, why are these houses sexist? And she said, well, because the kitchen is too far from the living areas. I said, that's anti-family. That has nothing to do with gender. And she said, because the areas where you wash clothes are separated from the areas where you use them. I said, that's anti-human. That is not anti-female. But the critiques are valid. The houses are not functional for today's family. They're designed for the Ozian period family that lived in the latter part of the 19th century. Home builders attack the models that we have today with the codes and all the impositions that planners place on them as too costly, and there is legitimacy to their claim. Architects are pretty much out of the housing business, not necessarily by conscious choice, and yet by default as a profession they're out. Landscape architects sometimes help to site the houses, but that doesn't change the house very much, and planners cheerfully add builders to add bike trails and bigger front yards, and be sure not to get the chimney too tall. While the chief building officials, who represent none of us, are eagerly enforcing ever more burdensome code requirements that become thicker and thicker and more complex and more expensive. The 21st century family, in contrast to the family for whom these houses were designed, is smaller. They're home much less, not home less, but they are home much less than the 19th century family. They're electronic oriented, they live differently, they use the houses differently. They have 1.4 breadwinners. I made that number up, but the point is there are significantly more breadwinners in the average. It has an error of reality if you look at family size and so on. But there are more breadwinners in these households. There are more cooks. There are more people participating in running the house, but there's nobody who stays home to be in charge of this large house anymore and take care of it the way it once were. It is a different sort of home. What's been lost through this period of time, and I take my examples today from a wonderful book called Yesterday's House is Tomorrow by a guy named Yandel, were houses like Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion dwelling machine. I assume most of you have seen pictures of this at some point, and the one model of it was actually built in Wichita. The Blue Scrub, all-metal house, the steel industry thought would bail them out of some of their economic difficulties at one point. The Moto home, the home that runs itself, which featured a Moto unit, which was a pre-built, pre-assembled plumbing and mechanical core that would be dropped by crane into the center of a house, so that you had very little on-site work to do with mechanical and plumbing work. None of which had ever come into common use, and most of which would be prohibited by many provisions of the building code that we use today. These houses, many of which were proposed in the 20s and 30s, and had innovations in some of them like mechanical rotating cupboards inside the walls. You punch a button so that they would rotate up and you would find exactly what you wanted. The highly efficient heating and cooling systems, innovative use of materials, things that we would find exciting and interesting and useful today. Innovative technology and operation, very efficient units. don't exist, and we're still delivering the 19th century house. Now, we as professionals don't make the building codes that, in my opinion, have stood in the way of housing innovation. But on the other hand, I don't see us on the front lines trying to get them changed, looking for innovative housing. We've got people like Tony Costello, Scott Truex, Dan Mendelson, Sonny Palmer, Gary Hagen, I saw here, all working on housing issues. And I think that's exciting, and this is one of the few schools where we have a group of people who are seriously focused on housing, but they're still nibbling around the edges. And what I really hope we'll be able to do with their research is to bring it together and go at the heart of the housing issues and rethink the living programs, rethink the fundamental design, rethink the technology, and really innovate in housing. What should the 21st century house look like? I frankly don't have a clue, but I gotta tell you that it might look a whole lot more like the abandoned proposals of the 30s than it will look like the neo-traditional pseudo-Victorians of the 90s. Then we go to one of my favorites, urban form. We have an urban form that is auto-oriented, and it is fun for us to stand around and blame it all on the highway engineers, or the highwaymen, as I like to call them from time, and they are mostly still male. But it ain't all their fault, folks. I gotta tell you that we've been there too, with our land use policies and zoning. The highway policies that have influenced urban form are all centered around one basic philosophy. Of course, there's been federal funding to implement this philosophy, which is a factor. But everything focuses on origin-destination studies. You all understand what an origin-destination study is. You've probably been involved in it. We take some 50-year planning students, we put them out in the middle of intersections wearing orange vests. They tap on people's car windows and say, no, we're not selling newspapers. Where did you come from? Where would you like to go? And we tabulate all this. We then assume that everyone ought to be able to get from wherever they came from to wherever they want to go, to do so in an individual car with nobody else in it, and to do so in a straight line. And that designs our highway system. It is auto-oriented. We make it convenient. And we have this underlying assumption that we will satisfy this demand. You want to get there? Of course we'll make it easy to get there. We don't have to let people get there. I had a call from, I got to be good buddies for some reason with the editorial page staff at the Mobile Register in Mobile, Alabama. And one of the stories they called me on was when a bridge fell down, which was a terrible tragedy down there. You may recall it was hit by a barge. And there were some people killed, and it involved the loss of human life. It was also a huge piece of infrastructure to lose. And a woman called me and said, well, we really want to understand what some of the options are. And I said, well, remind me. It seems to me this bridge leads from Mobile to Baldwin County to the north, where you've been having a huge amount of unmanaged suburban development. You've got a lot of development going in on septic tanks in the swamp, all sorts of environmental problems. You've overloaded the schools. I said, it seems to me that one of the options is not replacing the bridge. She said, what? I said, that is one of your options. It may not be the best option, but it's okay. Maybe you tell everybody they can't go there from here, and we're going to have a different sort of urban form. If you want to live in Baldwin County, it's not going to make it easy for you. That's a different view of urban form. But let's talk about land use and zoning, planners' contributions to this whole debate. One of the real innovations of zoning back in the 1920s was to protect residential neighborhoods. And by that I mean single-family detached residential neighborhoods. When the Supreme Court first upheld zoning, they said that one of the great values of this wonderful new tool would be that it would protect single-family neighborhoods. It would prevent things like apartment houses from coming into them, because allowing an apartment house into a nice neighborhood would be like allowing a pig in the parlor. And we have had this presumption behind zoning that we're going to protect the single-family neighborhood. It was only with the post-World War II boom where we actually built whole single-family residential neighborhoods with no services in them that we started to see the impact of this. The original neighborhoods that we protected already had some commercial development in them, and we just protected them from the expansion of that commercial development. Post-World War II, we started building whole neighborhoods with absolutely no services. They were all houses. Okay, you're living in a neighborhood, you're surrounded for 3/4 of a mile in every direction by single-family houses. You need a loaf of bread. You're probably not going to walk. You're probably going to get in your car. So now all of a sudden, instead of having a corner store that's a few blocks away in which you might walk, the people who are building the store have to realize that you're going to get there by car. And so they're going to build a development that is oriented to you arriving by automobile. Now, happily, planners were there to facilitate this with a couple of features. First of all, they always had a problem with the busy streets that ran by residential areas. What do you do with that? We'd like to have this area all residential. We got this really busy street like Jackson or something. We got to do something with that. We got to put some kind of land use along it. Well, we're probably going to allow offices or some sort of light commercial or something. We're not going to allow heavy industry or something in an area like this. So we're going to allow some commercial uses. How much are we going to allow? Well, it's really just the busy street that's a problem. So we're going to go back half a block or a whole block, and we're going to take a narrow strip all along this street and designate it for commercial use. And we have invented strip commercial. And I can show you community after community where this existed on the land use plan and on the zoning map long before Sam Walton bought a building along there. This was something that was invented by planners to solve another problem. Well, it fit in very nicely with all these service-free residential areas because it put areas with commercial services right along the major roads where people would be driving. And so now we have strip commercial, and to make it work even better, we came up with this wonderful idea of setting everything back from the street and make it very convenient to park in front. So you don't have the inconvenience of parking on the street and walking up the store. You just drive right up in front and park there. And again, that has the advantage of discouraging pedestrians, because nobody really wants to walk across that parking lot and the sidewalk with you moving in and out of it. So we as planners then helped to invent the strip commercial area. Well, now the whole retail trade is adapted to using the strip commercial area, and it's become part of the American landscape. We've created pedestrian hostile environments, and we continue to reinforce this with our own origin destination studies, with our zoning, and of course there's one more twist to zoning, which you don't want to miss in all of this, that zoning sets minimum lot sizes. Minimum lot sizes. If you want to build a house, you have to have at least this much land. In other words, you've got to use this much land. You can't use less. You can use more. Nowhere in the country have we thought of using maximum lot sizes and saying, wait a minute, we're running out of land. We would like to preserve some land. If you're going to use that much land, you got to get at least 8 houses on it or 12 houses on it. Now you can build as low density as you want, which again contributes to sprawl and reflects our land use preference for single family and attached home. In all of these, we have not heeded the call of Victor's Ruin and others like it, and even motor call. Things can be different, even in relatively ordinary communities. Let me just show you a couple of comparisons that I've done recently. Comparing Des Moines, Iowa and Lincoln, Nebraska. Very interesting comparisons. They're both state capitals, both located on Interstate 80. Des Moines has a metropolitan area population of about 290,000. Lincoln has a metropolitan population of about 190,000. The two of them are roughly 180 miles apart. Look at the differences between them. Lincoln, or Des Moines, is about 50% larger than Lincoln. It has more than double the land area. And I inverted the density figures on this slide. The real density of Lincoln is 2990, and the density of Des Moines is 1839 persons per square mile. The Lincoln area is a much more dense community. Now let me show you how this relates to transportation. Slide. The through traffic in Lincoln, there are about 21,000 people reaching Lincoln on the interstate at the west side. There are about 23,000 reaching it at the east side, which is where it's near Omaha, and we're going back and forth from Omaha. That imputes to through traffic on the interstate highway, Interstate 80, of about 22,000 trips per day. Des Moines has two interstates, Interstate 80 and Interstate 35. Interstate 80 is more heavily traveled there. It's got about 28,000 people, 28,000 trips per day at either end of the city. And if they were going straight through, you'd have about 28,000 trips per day going through the city. I-35, which goes to Kansas City and Minneapolis, has about 21,000 miles. Look at the difference in peak demand. In Lincoln, there is one segment of the road through town that actually has more traffic than there is at either end. And it has 28,000 cars per day, about 30% more. That's obviously used for commuting. Most of the other segments of the freeway through Lincoln actually have less traffic there is a deeper into town. In other words, more people get off in Lincoln and stay off the freeway than use that road for commute. In contrast, in Des Moines, which has a freeway that was ideally designed for commuting, the peak number of trips on that highway, which is I-235, that runs right through the heart of town, is 90,000 trips per day. 90,000 trips per day, roughly 3 times the typical traffic. And the other freeway has 47,000 trips per day, about 2 times the traffic. Lincoln has never built a commuter highway. Des Moines built a commuter highway, which has contributed enormously to sprawl. The state of Iowa is now looking at a $100 million expenditure to widen that road to make it work more efficiently. It won't make it work more efficiently. It will simply extend the sprawl. What are the differences between these two communities that really make a difference in all of this? There are several. Lincoln has no suburbs. Part of that's good planning. Part of that is a state law that lets them take over suburbs in their own county. That is a huge advantage. Des Moines actually has 17 other municipalities in the same county with it, plus half a dozen suburbs in the surrounding counties. That's a huge disadvantage in managing growth. In Lincoln, the city and county plan together, and that is essentially the regional plan because there are no other cities. In Des Moines, we have fragmented planning, as you would expect with these fragmented jurisdictions. Lincoln has carefully controlled the availability of sewer and water and kept it close in. In Des Moines, with a large number of local governments, you can get sewer and water service almost any place. Lincoln has carefully managed its annexation. The city of Des Moines did not annex in the high 30 years and allowed the suburbs to take in key territory and to grow at the expense of the central city. And the state in Des Moines decided to go a very convenient freeway for commuting. That's never been done in Lincoln. Now, the reason I use those two examples, neither of those are glitzy cities. This is not a seaside. This is not a development where professors are going to take students on field trips and look at them because it's so glitzy. They're pretty ordinary cities. And yet, with management techniques that we all understand, one city has really made a difference in its future, has really affected urban form. Finally, substantively, I want to talk to you about sustainability. And we have to think about sustainability at several levels. One is really at the micro level, dealing primarily with buildings. One of the things that thrilled me in coming here is the fact that we have the Energy Center, podcast with the Energy Center tonight, physically attached to this building and interwoven with its programs. And Bob is very much involved in our faculty and council in this building, and we have research fellows working there, we have students working there. And it's symbolically, this building has solar collectors and has a relatively energy efficient design, and there really is a commitment to saving energy here. I've seen too many other colleges of architecture that are art buildings that really reflect no concern at all with energy and sustainability. Site design, I'm just fascinated to watch Les Smith doing his microclimate studies to design better horse tracks. I haven't seen anybody use a microclimate study to design a better development since I left Grand Camp Sachs Wells in 1976. Now, I know people do it, but I've seen a lot of developments designed at time where nobody even looked at it, and here we're looking at things like this. But you know, we're going to teach you in class that ought to be central to everything we teach about development design. The use of materials. We talk about building materials, but we often talk about very traditional building materials. One of the revolutions that's going on in building today is the materials cost that all of a sudden made builders become recyclers, and there is now a huge demand for recycled and innovative building materials that we need to think about. And when we're dealing with these micro-level sorts of issues and even some of the macro-level issues, the environmentalists are not always helpful to us. For one thing, environmentalists often view human development as an unnecessary intrusion on the natural environment. And of course, we as design professionals have to recognize that we need human development because that's where human activity takes place. But we have to strike a balance. I was fascinated when I was working in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and we were looking at land restoration issues and getting rid of some of the contamination that was built up under the Manhattan Project during World War II, and trying to make rational decisions about the future of this land. And there were environmentalists involved with this who wanted the land restored to the way it was before the Department of Energy got there. You know how it was before the Department of Energy got there? There were people starving to death there trying to farm it. It was not in a pristine natural state. It had been used by humans, and it had been used in a basically unsustainable form of human development. It's a lousy site for agriculture. It's steep, it's rugged, it's isolated, and not real wet. All the reasons it was a real good site for a bomb plant. It was lousy for agriculture. I find Ann Wiston-Spurgeon's work exciting because she at least recognizes the city as an ecosystem itself. It's something that we ought to study and recognize the validity of that ecosystem as we're planning. There's good news in some of these micro-level issues. There are still lenders, during the energy crisis, all lenders were looking at maintenance and sustainability costs of housing and buildings. There are still lenders who are looking at that. But instead of being central to architecture, sustainability remains sort of a fringe issue. And I hope one of the things that's going to come out of some of the current studies in the part of architecture is that this is going to become a more central issue. But we also have to look at sustainability at the macro level, and that really comes back to issues of urban form. It comes back to the kinds of regional trade practices that Dave Ferguson's been studying in some of his work, looking at market substitution, looking at agricultural crop production that can actually serve the region. And these two are issues that we need to address. But even here, our professions are not always on the side of the angels. I would cite the green belt around Boulder, which makes the city pretty. It probably makes it environmentally more healthy. The studies that I did for my book on growth management indicate that it has also forced many of the people who live in Boulder to live 5, 6, 7, 8 miles outside the community and commute back and forth, which does not create a socially healthy environment. It's also not very energy efficient. And I'm not sure it's environmentally healthy since this is all an air basin and all of that extra commuting basically contributes to the air pollution woes in the area. We got to get a handle on some of these issues, and to do that is going to require education. Education of our future professionals, but also education of society in that need of knowing excellence and education of practicing professionals. These are some of the issues that interest me. I think we've got some issues that you all have brought together. Where am I, Greg? Where are you? Hiding over there. How do we do compiling issues? And I'm not going to address all of these, but I just want to tell you some of the things that we found. Okay, great. Thank you. Gee, isn't this interesting? Number one issue in this room, natural environment and sustainability. Number two, urban sprawl. Number three, by the way, number two is way behind number one. Number three, transportation problems. And then we drop down to a whole group, societal change, adaptive reuse and historic preservation, high-density housing, developing countries, public education and participation, crime and violence, diversity, a sense of place, and urban neighborhoods. I didn't do too badly, I'm kidding you. These are some of the issues, these are the very issues that we ought to be talking about, not only in our classrooms, but around the campus and off the campus to the larger community. Second major issue. Next, please. We're still low tech, change the slide. Forward. Left button. What's that? That's it. One more. Okay. We need to be interdisciplinary. And we need to be interdisciplinary among our professions. Those of you from outside this building may not realize how isolated even within this building we become, separating architects from landscape architecture and planners, and even separating the historic preservations from all of those. But we also need to be interdisciplinary with our colleagues from other parts of the university, our colleagues in other professions and society. And there are a whole lot of reasons for this. First of all, specialization narrows our range of options. How many of you are familiar with the work of James Lovelock, who's written about the Gaia hypothesis? Interesting guy. He is a physicist, a highly specialized guy, who has written some holistic views of the natural environment and argues that we have no hope of addressing our environmental issues if we continue to focus on the narrow specializations. And he writes about botany, and he writes about geology, and he writes about climatology, and addresses all of those issues because he says we cannot possibly grapple with all of these things without taking a holistic look at it. Looking at it from another perspective, it really is the notion of looking at whole systems versus the reductionist approach of looking at pieces. If you were to explain something at the Rod had a young man here this evening. If Rod were to try to explain to his son how a car worked by starting with one wheel, and then explaining the transmission, and then explaining the chassis, and then explaining a fender, and then explaining the gas tank, and do all this in pieces, the poor kid would be out of there. He'd say, my dad didn't know what he's talking about. I need to go someplace and learn something serious. The only way you can explain how an automobile works is by starting with the whole car. Les Aycock, who was a systems analyst, talks about this differently. He talks about solving problems by making uncontrolled variables controllable, which we do by stepping up one system level. Or we step out of the environment in which we're working to a larger environment that defines that one. To put it in an architect's terms, if you're commissioned to build to design an energy-efficient building, and you're given a terrible site, that can be a very difficult problem. If you're given control of choice of the site by stepping stepping up one system level, and getting control of the environment, so you get to choose the site, this becomes a much easier design exercise. We start taking control, making it up, taking control of the uncontrolled variables. A more folksy example of the same kind of thinking is the puzzle of the 9 dots. How many of you are familiar with the puzzle of the 9 dots? The object of the puzzle of the 9 dots is to connect all of them with 4 lines without picking up your pencil off the paper. And you draw 4 lines, you've got a square, right? You still got that missing dot in the middle. It turns out that there are any number of solutions, but all of them involve going outside the 9 dots. It cannot be solved staying inside the 9 dots. There are many solutions once you step outside the 9 dots. But the need to be interdisciplinary goes a good bit beyond all of that. It really involves interaction beyond our 3 departments, our 7 programs, the design professions. It involves our colleagues in education, with whom we would like to help us influence young minds about the importance of good design. Our colleagues in the College of Business, who will ultimately decide whether we get the money to build these wonderful sustainable projects that we would like to build. Our colleagues in fine arts, who themselves bring to society some aesthetic views different from, and probably, although we always hate to admit it, actually broader than our own. Our colleagues in interior design who have to deal with the use of spaces we create. How many of you are working in 5th and 6th floor studios right now with no power? Yeah, right. Isn't that fun? We create the spaces and somebody else gets to make them work. For those in political science, economics, sociology, and other social sciences who may understand better or at least differently than we the needs of a changing society. And as I talk to our alums, one common message from them is that they wish they had crossed the moat, crossed that asphalt moat out there more often, and studied more history. Yeah, Paul, and more history, more art, more social science, more business, more marketing. Our students, that was interesting, spell checker helped me out, need the arts and sciences. But others need us, or at least we need them too, because if we don't start educating all those students from all those other departments about the important role that we play, we're going to be less and less relevant to society. We get frustrated by the fact that banks and lawyers just plop down buildings in any old spot without regard to the site, without regard to the natural environment or sustainability, that they hire design-build contractors who have engineers do our work in a way that we would never do it, shouldn't allow. And yet we make little effort to educate the public about what we do. We should be trying to lower a 2-way drawbridge across that moat, inviting the future bankers, lawyers, accountants, government officials who will build buildings to learn what we do and why, using the time in our schedules that we make by sending our students across campus occasionally. We can increasingly isolate ourselves behind our private asphalt moat, behind our professional licenses and certifications, or we can place ourselves figuratively and as much as possible literally back at the center of life of our society and into the educational mainstream of this university where the larger society can shape us and we it. Finally, my 3rd topic, designing education to provide a relevant and effective learning experience for those who study with us. And the first element, of course, is learning how to learn. The most effective, the most important learning experience with undergraduates is learning how to learn. This is at the heart of liberal arts education, which uses the notion of a major to prove that we have learned to master a discipline, not necessarily to limit work in one field. And in doing these sorts of things, the studio does this very, very well. It's an effective learning experience. It's an engaging learning experience that teaches a design process. Design is a process. Although at some point, with studio education, which after all we always say, whether it's first year, second year, fifth year, we are teaching design as a process, I wonder if we're not guilty of the overkill of which former Harvard President Derek Bach accused his own law school, where he'd been dean, saying, I really don't think the third year's relevant because we're still teaching them to think like a lawyer, and we have every indication that after 2 years they know as much about how to think like a lawyer as they're ever going to know. And I'm not sure we're accomplishing much in the third year. And I think we need to think about that, not because we necessarily want to get rid of the year, but because there are so many other things we might be doing with it. And we need to think about effective learning. Effective learning is engaging learning. Studios are. That's part of the reason studios work so well, because they engage the students. That makes them satisfying to the students. That makes them satisfying to the professors. They're absolutely wonderful. Lectures are a lousy way to learn. Tony Costello's having a hard time staying awake, and I probably would be too after a long day. That's a lousy, lousy way to learn. Studios are like labs. They're hands-on learning where students teach themselves. This is the kind of learning that we most remember, and we're going to see if that's what you all do. But do we then overvalue studio for its own sake? Are we comparing studio education to the other experiences that our students have, which are almost entirely lecture courses unless they throw in a phys ed or a dance class, and saying, wow, studio is so much better than the lecture courses, the studio must be perfect and we should do nothing different? Maybe it's just the comparison subject is so bad that it's not a fair test. And should we be looking behind that to understand both the strengths and the weaknesses of studio to see what we can learn as we're trying to address some of the more complicated issues that I've been talking about earlier? Whether we can learn from the studio process things that we can use in teaching other things, and whether we can build on the strengths of that process in ways that do not emphasize its weaknesses. And there are weaknesses. It is incredibly time-consuming for faculty members, as many of you in this room remind me on a regular basis, and it is often incredibly time-wasting for individual students who spend a good deal of their time waiting for the occasional studio master. The substance and skills that we teach must be relevant. And here I give my colleagues at Ball State an A+. From talking with our alums, from talking with their employers, there is no question that you all have been doing, and I am determined that we will continue to do an absolutely first-rate job of providing students with relevant professional skills. But the relevance of the process, here we drop down in the C range, and I'm not sure C is good enough. Maybe it's good enough for government work, but I'm not sure it's good enough for what we're doing. And it's here that the studio model starts to fall down. It's built on the Beaux-Arts model of a studio master and a future star, and a handful of future stars in one room. In fact, few of our students will be studio masters or stars, a tiny, tiny percentage. Almost all of them will work on teams, not independently. Most of those teams will be interdisciplinary, which is generally not their experience in scholarship. Most of our students will use computers far more than they will use drawing boards once they get into practice. Now, admittedly, we have some problems that we have to deal with in studio. And that all has to do with the right side of the brain. If we could go back and reform the K-12 educational system so that we could get our kids with the creative talents that they have when they're 4, instead of having them after 14 years of being told to color inside the lines and follow directions and do it only the way the teacher says, and don't write the name on the top of the paper before you've been taught how to write your name, and please put your head down on your desk when you're finished with your work. And I recognize that somehow we have to undo all that damaging learning from the K-12 educational system. But it is important to reflect back on history again, and I use that term again. And remember the context in which the Beaux-Arts studio model was adopted. Because when it evolved, it wasn't really adopted, it evolved. But when it evolved, that more or less represented practice. It was when people read for the law, they learned architecture really by apprenticeship, starting under a studio master, and some of them were able to start under a studio master in an educational institution. But they learned most professions, even some learned medicine, really in apprenticeship kinds of settings. And that really is what the Beaux-Arts studio master model is all about. The nature of practice, the nature of professional education change. And without abandoning the many strengths of what we have in our current design education, I think we need to think about how relevant our current educational process still is. And I'm going to turn now for a minute to your own educational experiences and what works. And according to Greg and Megan, who compiled these, this has no bias here, at the top of the list, hands-on instruction, real-life issues, real-life work. Field trips, study abroad, are you hearing this engaging themes involved? A teacher who is there for more than just curriculum, but to teach about life. Personal interaction and discussions with teacher, again, a strength in the studio or a seminar model. A teacher upholding standards, and one of the best of all, learning by mistakes. Reminds me of the wonderful, wonderful story about when Tom Watson was still president of IBM, and his brother was the founder. I don't forget the founders, but they were the ones who really built IBM into big blue, the narrow ties, the black suits, and the white shirt. But they turned it into the dynamic it was for many years. And a young executive who had been running a project that had lost $10 million, and this was big money back in the 50s, which is when it happened, was called into the president's office, Tom Watson's office, called into the president's office, and he sat down and Watson looked at him and said, I suppose you want to know why I want to see you. And the young man looked at him and said, well, I'm sure you want to fire me. And Watson looked at him and said, young man, we couldn't possibly do that. We've just invested $10 million in education. And in fact, we do learn by mistake, and we often, I hope, learn more from our mistakes than we learn from our successes. But we can learn through the kinds of learning experiences that help us. And I think as we talk about, as we look at all of the things that we are trying to do, we have to think about the kind of learning you remember and the kinds of examples that you just gave me. You don't remember all those art plates that you remember in art history. You don't remember all the dates of all the explorers who landed on this continent. You don't remember, you probably don't remember the table of elements. You may not even remember all of your multiplication tables. And in fact, the studies of educational results indicate that we don't really remember very much of the material that we're asked to absorb. At best, we learn how to learn. We figure out that most of that stuff we don't remember is available in a reference book or today on a computer, and that there are other ways to get out. And a lot of it we're not going to use anyway. But we learn how to learn. And as we are looking at adjusting our curriculum and doing new things, I think we always have to keep in mind that we don't really remember a whole lot of what we learned in most of our college courses. And if we gave up one or two of those, as long as we still learn how to learn, we would probably still have a really good education. So we have to give up one or two of the things that we're teaching now so that we teach something new. Of course, that we let students study something else. It is not a tragic loss, because they're probably not going to remember much from that course anyway. Whether it's my course or your course or somebody else's course, really isn't the point. What we hope they will learn about is the process of learning. Finally, the process of education itself must be effective. It must result in learning. And we are coming more and more to be student-centered in the educational process, which is wonderful. We worry not so much about what we spout off about up here, but what the students have up here when they go out the door. And I don't even ask what they know when they go out the door. I consciously ask them what they remember 2 or 3 or 5 years later, because that's the real test of whether they learned anything from us all. But the process must also be effective to allow us to respond to new challenges. Some of the substantive challenges that I laid out tonight, which coincidentally happened to match a lot of the substantive challenges that you all listed, and you added some to that. so that we can begin to address some of those things. Process challenges, like how we teach the computers. I mean, we still have to teach all of these other things. We have to teach freehand drawing, and we have to teach technical skills, and we have to teach design communication, and we have to teach this, and we have to teach that. But somehow we got to get the computer in there too. And practice challenges, like the changing workplace. You all know what's happened to architectural employment, and I hope you're all thinking about the fact that many of the jobs that have evaporated are the entry-level apprentice-like jobs in which our graduates will learn many of the skills that in the past we've not needed to teach them in school. And we need to be thinking about whether we should be developing clinics or clinical courses and things like that to make up this gap in the educational process that was once served by firms hiring young students to detail windows and prepare spec sheets that are now done almost entirely by computer, really eliminating those jobs completely. We also need to have a process that is effective to respond to new challenges. To new opportunities. We're okay. Respond to new opportunities. Continuing education is a wonderful new opportunity. We all have messages to deliver, and of course we want to deliver them to the inquiring young minds who are fortunate enough to spend 3 or 4 or 5 years with us. But there are practicing professionals out there who can share in that. The AIA has been kind enough to encourage them to spend more time with us, and that is a wonderful opportunity to young seizing. There are substantive. Can we go forward? Thank you. Electronic distance learning, a whole process that we can use to reach an additional audience. That we may not be able to spend as much time with as we would like, but there are other ways to reach them. Getting our urban design program built. All of these are challenges. They're challenges, they're opportunities, they're take time, they're energy, and we've got to have a process that is effective enough to allow us to do that. And an effective process must work for all its participants. That means traditional learners, whom I think we have been serving very well. That's not to say we should be improved, but I think we've been serving them well. Non-traditional learners, whom we really have not been serving at all, or very, very, very little, and we need to begin to serve. And our faculty, whom we don't serve as well as we should because we have them locked in studio so much. We make it difficult for them to grow and to develop in ways that they would like to. And the process needs to work for all of those. And I'm giving you all these new things that we should do. And I don't think you can fit one more hat in without taking a hat off, or at least cutting it in half or squishing 2 of them together, which is really what we have to talk about. We can't do more, so we've got to do different. To me, an effective process of education gives our students time to go to concerts and plays and basketball games and movies, and leaves our faculty with a little reflective time in the office as well as some time for concerts and plays, basketball games and movies, and even to work with the odd business or theater student who finds his or her way across the moat and wants to know a little bit more about what we do. Leave time for life. How do we do all of that? I have some suggestions, but no real answers, no hidden agendas. What it looks to me like is a complex problem needing a creative solution. The sort of thing to which we ought to apply the process of design. We tell our students that they can apply design as a problem-solving process to a great variety of problems and opportunities in life. I think it's time to apply it to ours. There's a small group trying to do that in architecture. Their work's going to get tested, and there are 1 or 2 things, there are 3 things we can do. We can ignore it, which we're not going to do, so it won't let us ignore it. We can look at it and say, oh, that's really dumb, and pay no attention to it. I suppose we could study it to death, which would be the traditional academic model. Or we could give it a really constructive jury, the way we try to give our students and say, wow, you folks have some really interesting ideas, and some of them we love, and some of them we're not sure about, and a couple of them we hate, and let us give you a jury critique that will make them work. Because that's really what design as a process is all about. And when they come forward with a set of recommendations, not because they're architects, not because they're that particular group, but because they're moving forward on something we all ought to be moving forward to, I hope we will give them a constructive jury critique that we would give to our very, very best students who are working on our very most important topics, and not just look for a way to flunk them out of school. As we do all of this, I think there are 2 models that are helpful to us. And I'll conclude with this. One is Boyer's teacher scholar, and we talked a lot about that. And sometime later this year, we're going to see your study of the architectural education come forward, and I think that will be useful to all of us. And Donald Schoen's reflective practitioner, one who really practices but learns from practice, which I hope is the kind of practitioner who we're educating here, the kind of practitioner who those of you who are students today will become. And I think that most of us share those values, the values of Donald Schoen, reflective practitioner, values of Ernest Boyer, and the teacher-scholar. But as I look at our P&T criteria and our graduate faculty criteria, with the emphasis on refereed articles rather than built projects, on lighting rather than practice, I wonder whether we believe what we say. And while I don't want those documents to be so narrow as to reject the historian or other more traditional academic among us, I think that the emphasis on them should be on the reflective teacher-scholar who can educate the reflective practitioners of the 21st century, the practitioners who will use the processes we teach to design solutions to some of the complex problems facing our society as it designs the human-built environment for the 21st century. The substantive challenges and opportunities for design education for the 21st century are the challenges and opportunities of society, and in particular the built environment that serves our society. The procedural challenges and opportunities for design education for the 21st century are the design challenges to create a humane, you've heard this term before and you'll hear it again, a humane process to do all of this that works for us all. Thanks for sharing this time with me this evening.